Okay, so welcome everyone. I think we are starting to get people let in to our webinar. My name is Orez Zakidaiski. I'm with the Ukrainian Canadian Congress National Office in Ottawa. And just one brief housekeeping item. If you have questions from our guests, please type them into the Q&A chat whenever you like during the presentation. And we will have about 25 minutes for Q&A after Lieutenant Colonel Lake's presentation. It is my pleasure to introduce the moderator and master of ceremonies for tonight, retired Colonel Andriy Sukhanilsky, who since 2015 has been president of the Ukrainian War Veterans Association of Canada. From 1984 to 1987, Captain Sukhanilsky served with the Royal Canadian Air Force as a air combat systems officer. Since 2015, he's been president of the Ukrainian War Veterans Association. He is a member of the UCC Advisory Council, and he also serves on the Remembrance Committee of the Toronto branch of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, and we are very grateful to have Andriy with us tonight. So please, Andriy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Orest, and good evening and welcome to the Operation Unifier 2021 update. I should make a small correction. I was not colonel, but captain. As Orest mentioned, I'm president of the Ukrainian War Veterans Association of Canada. The Ukrainian War Veterans Association of Canada is Canada's oldest Canadian veterans organization, now approaching a century of civic duty to Canada. Before proceeding further, I'd like to acknowledge that this evening in attendance, we have His Excellency Andriy Shevchenko, Ukraine's ambassador to Canada, Lieutenant General retired Paul Winnick, former Vice Chief of Defense Staff and Commander of the Canadian Army, and Colonel Andriy Shmylek, military attaché at the Embassy of Ukraine in Ottawa. With brutal combat operations taking place in Ukraine for the first time since the Second World War, and the Canadian Armed Forces playing an active role in helping build and renew Ukraine's military capabilities and supporting NATO allies in Eastern Europe, the UWVA has begun to channel its efforts in fostering relationships between the Canadian and Ukrainian militaries and the Ukrainian Canadian community and supporting military-related projects such as veterans programs. Behind me and on the advertisement for this event, you can see a red badge. This badge is the shape of an arrowhead, symbolizing military strength and purpose. It is red and white, representing the colors of the Canadian flag. In the center is a sword supported by an angel wings, symbolizing that this mission is righteous. It contains a blue cross depicting its roots to the Ukrainian War Veterans Association. It also contains a maple leaf and trident, symbolizing Canada's support and resolve for Ukraine. At bottom are inscribed the Latin words pro patria, meaning for country, for Canada, for Ukraine, and for all countries of Eastern Europe. This is the emblem of Canada Battalion. By being here today and showing your interest and support for the mission and the Canadian Armed Forces and the Armed Forces of Ukraine, you are all members of Canada Battalion. If I could ask that we all pause for a moment of silence to honor those that have served in the armed forces in the defense of their country and the free world. Thank you. Before we get going, I would like to introduce introduce our key speaker for the evening, Lieutenant Colonel Melanie Lake. I would like to introduce and invite the National President of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, a key sponsor of this event, Alexandra Fichi, to the virtual podium for a greeting. Alexandra.
Дякую, Андрію. Dear friends, дорогі друзі, шерзамі, добрий вечір and good evening. The Ukrainian Canadian Congress is very pleased to co-host this evening's event, and we very much look forward to hearing from you, Lieutenant Colonel Melanie Lake. For more than 7 years, the Ukrainian people have been at war defending their country against Russia's ruthless aggression. In the first days and weeks of the Russian invasion in 2014, the Ukrainian armed forces were unprepared and unequipped to defend Ukraine. But that quickly changed. In a very short time, Ukraine's military underwent a profound transformation and became a fighting force that Ukrainians take great pride in. That transformation has in no small part been aided and assisted by Canadian Armed Forces personnel who since 2015 have deployed many times to Ukraine as part of Operation Unifier. Some 25,000 Ukrainian service members have benefited from the training provided by Unifier. In turn, Canadian personnel have learned lessons from their Ukrainian colleagues about defending against hybrid warfare. As both Ukrainians and Canadians, we are very proud of the relationship that has developed between Canada's and Ukraine's armed forces. In 2015, I had the honor of visiting the headquarters of the Joint Multinational Training Group in Starichy, along with Prime Minister Trudeau, and saw firsthand the work that our Canadian forces are doing to help Ukraine improve and build its capacity and capability. It is in times of turbulence and trouble that one finds out who one's true friends are, and it is of great comfort to our community that Canada is indeed a true friend to Ukraine. It is in that spirit of friendship and gratitude that we welcome Lieutenant Colonel Lake this evening.
Thank you, Alexandra. And now let's proceed with this evening's keynote presentation by Lieutenant Colonel Melanie Lake. Raised in Churchill Falls, Labrador, Lieutenant Colonel Lake graduated from the Royal Military College of Canada in 2002 with a degree in mechanical engineering. She's been immensely privileged to serve in all 3 combat engineering regiments in Canada, most recently as the commanding officer of 2 Combat Engineering Regiment in Petawawa, Ontario. Lieutenant Colonel Lake has also served as an instructor at the Canadian Forces Leadership and Recruit School, spent time as a human intelligence operator, worked in the Office of the Chief of the Defense Staff as a senior staff officer, and oversaw engineer operations and plans at the Canadian Joint Operations Command. She has extensive overseas operational experience, having deployed to Afghanistan 3 times, and most recently to Ukraine as commander of the 11th Task Force Rotation of Operation Unifier. We are very pleased and honored to have with us this evening. She completed her command rotation in Ukraine just this past weekend and has just returned to Canada just a few days ago to her partner and young daughter. So we are perhaps the very first to hear her report on the mission this evening, and grateful that she has offered to speak to us this evening on Operation Unifier. Lieutenant Colonel Lake, the virtual podium is yours.
Sorry, mute. Дякую, Andre. Шановні гості, добрий вечір. Thank you for having me here this evening. So my name is Lieutenant Colonel Melanie Lake, recently handed over command of Operation Unifier. So I will jump right in to my presentation to make sure that I save lots of time at the end for questions and discussion. If there's no objections to that, I'll get right into it. Okay. Just want to confirm, can somebody give me a verbal that you can see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So for those not overly familiar with Operation Unifier, there's 2 primary components to this mission under the Defense Team Nexus. So line of effort 1 is our security force capacity building component, and that's the part run by our Canadian Joint Operations Command, the military side, and that is the component of the operation that I was leading. On the other side, and that's largely focused at the tactical level. On the other side, we've got line of effort 2, which is focused on security sector reform. And that is spearheaded largely by Associate Deputy Minister Policy. These two sides are brought together by the Strategic Joint Staff through weekly discussions to make sure that we're working, in unity of effort. And for us, for Joint Task Force Ukraine, our mission is to support security forces of Ukraine, and that includes the armed forces, the National Guard, the Border Guards, Defense Intelligence, supporting security force Ukraine reforms, professionalization, capacity building in order to assist them on the path to NATO interoperability and readiness for operations. Now, obviously, that most specifically refers to operations in the Joint Forces operations area, where they are facing off against Russia on a daily basis. So just to start with a bit of context for the beginning of our tour. So we deployed in towards the end of March 2021, right in the middle of the third wave. So we had a very interesting beginning to the tour. I actually caught COVID during my handover with Lieutenant Colonel Kier, the outgoing commander from Roto 10. So neither of us were actually present for our TOCA, our change of command parade. We participated virtually. So I immediately went into quarantine upon finding out that she had tested positive, and shortly thereafter got my own positive test result. Then a night or two into my isolation period, my team came to the door and said, "You have to come in to the talk for a secure call." And turned to them, I'm like, "I can't really go anywhere. I'm a biohazard right now." And they're like, "No, you really have to come in and take this." So we got the call at that point that European Command had changed their warning level to imminent threat as Russia was building significant forces up on the border. So it was, a very uncertain beginning. So I had to communicate to my troops that, although I absolutely should be in isolation and not anywhere out and about, unfortunately, COVID was not the only threat that we were dealing with in that moment. And there was no way to manage this situation without access to secure comms. So this very quickly, and again, just to situate, we were made up of personnel from 46 different units across the country. And the majority of our pre-deployment training had all been virtual because of the COVID environment. And even the minute we hit the ground in Ukraine, our task force is spread out over about now up to 15 locations. So the minute we hit the ground, we dispersed. So there were many members of the team who hadn't even had a chance to meet each other face to face. And now we were dealing with two crises simultaneously. COVID-19, we were dealing with the British variant, and it spread like wildfire through our task force. So our personnel were rapidly going into isolation at the same time as we were trying to understand what Russia's intentions were and what it meant for our task force. But it very quickly brought us together as a team. We worked through all of our contingency plans, and we actually relied very heavily on Task Force Latvia, because we have a very small intelligence footprint. Task Force Latvia, is continuously watching this problem space, and they kind of became our eyes and ears as we watched as Russia built up and tried to distinguish, looking for those signs that distinguish between an operation or an exercise as it was being touted. So this made everything real very fast. It really drove home the threat that Ukraine is dealing with on a daily basis, the existential threat, and made it very clear to our personnel, why we are here and why it was so important, the work that we had to do to help Ukraine and the security forces of Ukraine prepare for this continuous threat. So when we looked at how to tackle this mission, we broke it down into 5 operational objectives. The first being to increase NATO interoperability. The second primary objective being to deter Russian aggression. And by looking to do that through increasing success and survivability in the JFO. The more, I guess, secondary objectives were to develop our own capabilities from what we could learn in theater, to increase our mission capacity to deliver on security force capacity building. So to increase our output and our support to the Ukrainians. And finally, to communicate what we're doing and engage with the local population and our home population to a certain extent. So talking about NATO interoperability, we started thinking about, what is it that connects us as NATO allies, and how do we work towards assisting Ukraine's path towards that goal. We deduced it to common purpose and collective defense, which is more, at the strategic and political level. But then getting down into the space where we were working, we're talking about shared values, shared mindset, and the very tangible piece of common language, meaning, proficiency in English, working off the same sort of standard operating procedures, planning process, orders, even things as simple as, well, not necessarily as simple, but as basic as communicating our locations using the same type of grid system. So when we looked at this, if we're working towards NATO interoperability, what value, what effects does that bring on the ground? So the combination of embracing those shared values, and by that meaning that military ethos, values-based decision-making, all of those things that protect the legitimacy of the profession and preserve the trust of the population, along with shared mindset. So this is where we get into all of the things that help NATO countries understand each other. So our kind of common leadership philosophies, our embrace of mission command, how we aim to empower our leaders at all levels, maneuverist approach, command team approach. So putting all of this together, communicate it through a common language, offers a really powerful tool to counter Russian influence and to counter it on the cognitive plane, which is arguably the most important in the modern battle space. But also, when we talk about embracing NATO planning process, like that certainly increases your operational effectiveness. It speeds up your decision making, increasing retention, as people often don't leave their jobs, they leave their bosses. People want to be empowered, want to have the space to own their job and responsibilities. But mainly, we're talking about increasing interoperability. Interoperability is a bit of a vague term, though. So this is one of the primary national goals that Ukraine has set out. I mean, it's outlined in their national security strategy that was published in 2020, confirming that a strategic objective is to join NATO and naming Russia as the aggressor. Right now, at the strategic level, there's 46 partnership goals that have been outlined agreed upon between Ukraine and NATO, moving towards interoperability at the highest levels. Things like C2 reform, civil democratic control of the military, women, peace and security, defense planning and national resilience, but and fully embracing democratic values. But down at the tactical level, that looks very different. It looks a lot more tangible. It's about mutual understanding of each other's planning process so you can plug in and work through that together. It's about understanding how each other conveys order so you can actually understand what's being conveyed and know what sequence you're going to hear material in. It's understanding, similar tactics, similar decision-making process, right down to the very tangible pieces of having your communication networks be able to talk to each other, figuring out how to get interpreters into the right places so that you can work through the language barriers, how to facilitate things like call for fire from a Ukrainian battery onto a NATO position and vice versa, logistics support. all of these sort of things. And we had some really interesting opportunities to work through these up close and personal. You know, at the very ground level, the picture in the top left-hand corner, that's two of my officers who were participating in ex-Vladimir's Trident this summer with the National Guard. When I arrived there, you know, you could barely tell the difference between the Ukrainian soldiers and the Canadians. The Canadians were all patched up with National Guard insignia. The Ukrainians, the National Guard soldiers, were all wearing Unifier patches and Canadian flags. And the first Master Corporal I ran into, you know, he said, "This is the best experience I've had so far in the military, and I would go to battle with these soldiers tomorrow." Then, you know, we come up one level. So we participated in exercise Cossack Mace. That was an exercise where we saw a British battalion, 4 Scots, deploy to Ukraine and serve side by side with the 1st Battalion of 54th Brigade. And this one was certainly more challenging. And you know, some of the pictures here, like the picture in the middle of the top and on the right-hand side, this is during the defensive live fire, watching them try to make a communications bridge, figure out how 4 Scots can communicate with the brigade commander, with a young, you know, a single young British lieutenant in the middle, trying to understand what his role is, and you know, realizing that this is a tough problem and we've got a long way to go there. Now, part of that was that I don't think there was enough deliberate focus put on interoperability. The UK, when deploying on this exercise, had, you know, some strategic objectives. Strategic communications was a big part of it, but also looking to test their force projection from the UK into Ukraine. So once they hit the ground, both of those key objectives had largely been accomplished. So, you know, there wasn't the deliberate effort put into an integrated exercise as opposed to 2 exercises kind of running side by side. But a real kind of shining example of interoperability in the midst of that exercise is in the bottom on the middle. That's a team of about 10 soldiers from Canada who fully integrated with the Ukrainian opposing forces based out of CTC Cherokee land. And they fought side by side the whole exercise and exchanged a ton of valuable lessons. So at the base level, at the ground level, this stuff works. And there is very little when it comes to interoperability that can't be overcome with will, desire, and some deliberate planning. So I think we owe Ukraine a bit of a better answer on what does interoperability mean and what level we want to achieve that. When Lieutenant General Cloutier, commander of Landcom, NATO Landcom, came to visit this summer, he talked about, you know, do we really need to be interoperable under the corps level? And I certainly think the answer is yes. When you look at how we operate, for example, in our enhanced forward presence battle groups in Latvia, you know, when the balloon goes up, a lot of countries, you know, NATO is a broad coalition, and countries have a wide spectrum of what they can contribute. And you know, you certainly will be into the space where there's countries who will want to contribute a company that will integrate into a battle group, or a platoon that will integrate into a company. So we need to get this right at the lowest level, just as much as it's important to get it right at the highest level. So how we look to tackle this, our mission has evolved, you know, extensively over the last few years. We started off very much focused, like the Americans, in CTC Yagarev in the west of the country, their very first combat training center. But since we deploy with very wide arcs for our mission commanders, people have sort of analyzed the problem and seen where there's opportunity to do more. And we have evolved into a very comprehensive approach. So when we talk increasing NATO interoperability, we attack this on multiple fronts. So one of the most important is, you know, influencing the change in mindset and values. We do that through professional military education reform. So we've got teams in multiple officer academies, multiple of the NCO academies, where they are developing their leadership curriculum and really shaping the next generation. And within everything we do there, we're trying to integrate the human elements. So talking about mission command, command team approach, leadership, gender, ethics, values, all of these, more difficult concepts to understand that can't be distilled into a checklist or an algorithm. Because, if you can give the security forces of Ukraine a clear algorithm and path to reform, they nail it. It's the more human side that's and the mindset piece that's a little more challenging. Next side of that is reforming the individual training system. So we concentrated our efforts in Desna, the 169 Training Center with the Armed Forces, and in Vyshgorod with the National Guard, as well as the MP Academy. So teams were working on things like curriculum development, building standard cells, trying to build self-sustaining capacities, building their instructor capacities, introducing military grid reference system as opposed to the old Soviet SK-42 means of communicating your location. And with all of that, trying to teach the systems approach to training. So building, again, a self-sustaining capacity to continue this work once we leave. A few more initiatives that have stood up. When NATO Landcom came to visit in the summer, we were introduced to the operational capabilities and components evaluation and feedback program. This is where Ukraine can actually declare, and any NATO partner country can declare units or subunits to NATO, and they go through basically a 4-year program to be certified interoperable. There's a lot we can do to support that, and we've jumped into that full stream. Artillery reform. We stood up during this rotation a fires integrated support team, understanding that fires interoperability and airspace management and deconfliction of airspace and fires is a huge piece when it comes to being interoperable on the battlefield with NATO. And it's one of the areas where there's a big gap. The Ukrainian forces right now still tend to lean towards deconfliction as opposed to integration. So significant work that we can do there. And then the final piece of that is C2 structure, so command and control structure, moving towards the NATO continental staff system, as well as introducing our planning process. We've pretty much wide scale adapted the American military decision-making process and troop leading procedures at the tactical level, and then operational planning at the higher level. So the next main objective is deterring Russian aggression and enabling success and survivability in the JFO. So really important with this to understand the primary threats, like what is getting people killed on the battlefield. And speaking with our counterparts, these are things like the high explosive threat, artillery fire, sniper fire, lack of good medical training, and lack of training on the medical evacuation chain. At one point, the National Guard was suffering about 60% of their casualties because soldiers couldn't be evacuated off the battlefield fast enough before bleeding out. So again, we jumped into this looking at kind of 3 different things and trying to integrate them all together. So building combat specialties, these are some of the core capabilities that are very important in the fight. So recce and sniper. On top of that, the sapper skills. Actually, I'll talk about those in a second, and artillery. Then medical, so focusing on everything from developing the combat medic trade, teaching tactical combat casualty care in preparation for deployment, but then starting to introduce medical training into collective training. So from point of injury up until that role 1 medical station at the battalion or brigade level where they can be cared for and evacuated further. Then engineer training, very comprehensive approach here. So we're working in individual training in CTC, KP, the sapper school, and with the NGU, building their actual sapper capabilities, then supporting the integration of, explosive threat hazard awareness training into collective training, but also working with engineers in the professional military education realm, mainly at the National Army Academy. Then in terms of support to collective training, we've focused our efforts on Combat Training Center Cherokee Land. So this is in the south, down by Mykolaiv. It's probably about 5 years behind in terms of development from CTC Yagorov in the west. And because the Americans are firmly anchored to CTC Yagorov, we've shifted focus to CTC SL. So we're looking at institutional support there, like building up their instructor cadre. Operational support, so providing observer, controller, training and support to the rotational training brigades that are coming through for 8-week training packages before they go into the JFO, Joint Forces area. Then helping with exercise design, exercise planning, capturing lessons learned, really focusing on tactical interoperability and making this a bit of a center of excellence for tactical interoperability. Then really working to integrate life-saving training into the programs for all of these rotational training brigades coming through. So that's your medical, your ether, counter sniper, talking about NCOs in the battle space. I won't spend as much time on these. This is just, really our efforts to communicate and connect with Ukrainians, with Canadians, and with our multinational partners. So trying to communicate our message, counter disinformation. Community outreach is a big part of this, and that's really important for, helping to counter some of the disinformation about NATO and the distrust. We prioritized our efforts on youth, veterans, and military families, but also tried to be very visible, or at least more visible, in the south and the east of the country, where we've typically had less of a presence in the past. Then, really trying to do everything we can to be seen. So when we're traveling, when we're walking around the city, we're in our uniform, we're answering questions about why we're there, and trying to put a human face on the mission. The outreach program, I think, is a huge success. Like I mentioned, everybody has been involved in it. Every training group just took this on and brought it to the next level. Just a few, examples here. One of our efforts in the East, we went to Dnipro, to the Military Medical Clinical Center. This is basically the Role 3 hospital for the southern part of the JFO. So all the casualties in the southern part are evacuated back to here. And they're underfunded, under-equipped. So we went there for a visit, looking for an opportunity to connect Canadian diaspora with, knowing the legacy that organizations like yours have in the country and have been connected from the very start of the conflict. I thought this would be a really great opportunity to make a solid connection between our diaspora and this facility that really needs assistance. And when we went there, we saw, they very proudly showed us one of the, I believe it was 10 ambulances that were donated by Canada back in the beginning of the conflict. And this ambulance alone has conducted over 4,000 evacuations from the JFO since that time. And it's in immaculate condition, and they're extremely grateful. And I believe the Ukrainian Canadian Federation has decided to partner with us on that one. Then other, low-level fundraisers, but really great work. Like the picture in the bottom right is the Stefanage Orphanage down in Mykolaiv, where our collective training team has done so much work, like raised a ton of money, gone to visit them frequently, did a ton of renovations, all on their own time. The picture above there in the middle is our engineers doing a beard off fundraiser, where they let all of the young children shave them for fundraising, all of their beards, and all of that money went back into the orphanage. And then, a great connection with Veterans Hub, an NGO that offers all kinds of really valuable services to war veterans. So hugely beneficial for us, for the mission, in terms of, putting a human face on what NATO soldiers are and what Canadian soldiers are, but also I think a lot of great impact on the ground to the organizations we work with. Increasing mission capacity for security force capacity building. This is just looking at, how can we do more? How can we leverage money? How can we work better with our interagency partners in the country, the police mission, GAC, public safety, CBSA. Moving our headquarters to Kyiv was a huge part of this. We were able to operationalize our headquarters like never before, leveraging all this staff power and secondary roles, multinational partners, pulling in more joint, then developing our own capabilities. Like someone mentioned in the beginning, there is so much that we can learn from the Ukrainian armed forces. I mean, this is a battle-hardened military that has been at war with Russia for the last 7 years. I just want to point out a couple really visible examples of this. So these images are from Exercise Cossack Mace this summer. On the left, you've got the 4 Scots battle group as they were getting ready. They were in an assembly area about to occupy their defensive position. So they were spending the night here. So you see them, they are lined up basically like they're on a parade square, very much like we would have done in a league or back in Afghanistan. Then the picture on the right, I would need about 4 more screens to show you the assembly area for the Ukrainian battle group. This is lessons learned in blood. I mean, the Ukrainians were subtly in the background laughing at the Brits for putting themselves in such a vulnerable position, talking about how one artillery strike and the entire battalion is gone. They also do a great job of hugely integrating UAVs into everything they do at every level, whether it's to provide feedback for training or supporting a section commander who's about to go and attack a position. Much more integration. Cam and concealment and deception and dispersion. Again, these are all lessons learned in a fight that is dominated by artillery and eyes in the sky and reconnaissance and snipers. They do not pay lip service to concealment in the way that we often do. Survivability and concealment on defensive positions. I mean, they are always well dug in, well concealed. And these are some of the lessons that, I'm taking back to my regiment. I mean, not to mention all of the lessons and the security forces were outstanding in being willing to share these lessons with us, really willingly sharing things that they're learning on the engineer front, artillery, etc. Just to give you a quick snapshot of how widely dispersed we are in the country. So I mentioned 15 different locations that we're permanently occupying, but that varies and sometimes it's even higher. So we have, quite a dispersed footprint, great coverage across the country. And it also makes it a beautiful test bed for mission command for our force, because some of these locations, it's 2 people and a sergeant is a senior person, and they are just owning their space and doing amazing work. Our partners in theater, so it's a great kind of coalition of the willing. We're all on bilateral training missions, Up Orbital, the UK mission, JMTGU, the American mission, Lithuania, and then a couple other elements from the US, a Doctrine and Education Advisor Group, Office of Defense Cooperation out of the embassy. We work together really well, just on a cooperative basis through, we've established a multinational coordination center underneath the Multinational Joint Commission. So all voluntary, but extremely effective for producing unity of effort without a lot of overhead. I'll go through this super quick because I realize I'm getting short on time, but broad challenges to reform is obviously the fact that they are at war and they are trying to change so much while fighting on a daily basis. There are a lot of old mindsets still there. Blame and shame is a huge part of the problem. This culture of punishment, when something goes wrong, it's not about finding out how to make sure what we need to do to make sure it doesn't happen again. There's a tendency to go towards who do we blame, and that stifles initiative. It crushes trust, and it results in people just not being empowered, whether that's junior officers or senior NCOs. gender perspectives, there's certainly a lack of diversity right now in senior leadership, and that leads to, you know, things like we saw the high heel incident with young female cadets, you know, practicing for the 5-kilometer march down the Krishavik in their high heels. We can talk more about these in questions and answers because I want to make sure I leave time. So some of the successes, over 5,500 soldiers trained on our rotation, but that's over 30,000 total. You know, us being on the ground, although we're an unarmed training mission, there is certainly a deterrence value that comes from this. General Homchuk talked about it after the Russian buildup in the spring, like what a difference it made having NATO soldiers on the ground there. Truly building, you know, real solid combat capabilities that are sustainable. 25 MP training company, we have worked ourselves out of a job there. So great success. I think we really are having an impact in terms of changing some of the mindsets. And I think, you know, what Canada does great is we show up when it matters. So, you know, we were there on the ground when the buildup was happening. We kept operating. We were there for the 30th anniversary, walking down the Krishavik with the rest of the free world, you know, showing that Ukraine is not alone in this fight, and we are there with them. There's also a ton of benefits that this mission brings for our force. You know, like I mentioned, huge in terms of mission command. And like from this mission, I'm sending home empowered, confident junior leaders who are coming with all kinds of skill sets that we need in our military right now, you know, to revamp our individual training system as we're trying to rebuild from COVID, trying to drive culture change. I mean, we've worked side by side with the Ukrainians as they're trying to do this. We've got young officers, NCOs, who've been teaching leadership for 6 months, teaching operational planning. They become independent. And they're coming back with 6 months of absorbed lessons that they've learned about the adversary, all of those things that Ukraine has learned in blood. And I think it brings a lot of credibility to us with both the host nation and the multinational partners, the work that we do there. So, you know, we kept saying while we were there on the ground that we might not be there with you on the battlefield, but I sure hope they know that we are firmly behind them. And I think, you know, our team certainly is all walking away as staunch supporters of the cause of Ukraine and the Ukrainian armed forces, the security forces at large. So I will stop it there and turn it over for questions.
So if I could ask August if you could, I guess, tally or assemble the questions for Lieutenant Colonel Lake. You may need a few seconds for that.
Absolutely. I just want to mention, Lieutenant Colonel Lake, that in the chat, you are getting a lot of greetings and shoutouts from people. So if you have a sec while you're answering questions, or maybe after, if you want to read over those.
Oh.
I will so we are taking questions into the Q&A function. So the first one that came up was, how would you rate the relationship between non-commissioned officers and officers in the Ukrainian army as compared to the Canadian army?
I think that's one of the areas where there is a big gap right now. And it's not necessarily, the gap isn't necessarily in the competence of the senior NCOs. The gap is in recognizing that and being willing to take the risk of delegating responsibility to them. We had the chance, my Sergeant Major and I had the chance to speak at the strategic seminar to the general staff back in April when we first arrived. And we talked a lot about officer NCO relations and the benefits to operational effectiveness that come from empowering your NCOs. And I guess General Homchuk mentioned afterwards, you know, well, if we had NCOs like they're talking about, we wouldn't need officers. And the J1 at the time said to me, like, well, you know, we really appreciated what you said, but a lot of our officers didn't understand it because our NCOs aren't at that level. And, you know, I asked him, I'm like, have you been to any of the NCO leadership academies? Have you seen the work that they're doing there? Because it's pretty incredible. So the NCO Corps is rising, and they will be ready when we're able to sort of, I guess, convince the officer corps of the value that they bring and to delegate authority and responsibility to them. The other piece of it is in like the officer training, you know, they're trained so technical and specific. Like I went to visit the National Academy of the National Guard of Ukraine in Kharkiv, and, you know, they teach their officers every little component of a vehicle engine. Whereas back home, we would teach them how to manage the technicians, the NCO technicians who are the specialists to fix that engine. So when you get your officers down into that over specification, you kind of cut some of the space for your NCO. So that's an area, you know, we try to reinforce it even with honors and awards at the end, recognizing some of these senior NCO leaders with Commander CJOC accommodations. Just every chance we got, we talked about the value that NCOs brought. And, you know, I think some of our NCOs on the ground did far more to convince them than any of the words I said with the incredible work that they did on the ground.
Okay, thank you. The next question we had was, what are the lessons that Canadian troops have learned from Ukrainian ones?
Oh, so many, so many. So I mean, I talked about, you know, just the very visible ones, the how much of a focus they put on cam concealment and dispersion in operations. You know, how much they recognize the threat from the air and the combination of UAV and artillery and the innovative ways that they are countering the UAV threat. Another one is how well civil society and the armed forces work together. I know so many of the NGOs, you know, stepped up, even ones from back home in Canada, stepped up to supply equipment and training back in the early days of the conflict when the forces simply didn't have it. But that has continued, and you know, there's a lot of capability development going on side by side between civil society and the armed forces, and that's something that, you know, I watch here, thinking that we as Canadian military, we often think we're the only people of value on the battle space, and I think we need to take more of that approach. Tons of lessons learned on the engineer front, watching the type of, you know, extremely prevalent explosive threat that that they're facing. I mean, learning tons, watching them do assault water crossings and things like that. But yeah, the prevalence of use of UAVs at all levels. I could go on and on. We have learned a ton from them. There is no doubt that they are a highly capable, battle-hardened military that that brings a lot to the table.
Okay, great, thank you. The other we had a question about sorry, whether or not Ukraine has female officers and whether you have been training them.
Yes, but you know, we met a lot of great young women in I would say like the lieutenant colonel and down ranks, and they are doing a lot of great work. All trades are less actually. The sapper trade are open to women, but you don't find them anywhere. You do, much like, you know, actually much like our own military, you do find higher percentages of women in trades like logistics, medical, and on the Ukrainian side, in international cooperation and military military linguists. Where you don't find a lot of women is in the senior ranks. Now that is starting to change. They did just have the first female general commander of a command appointed, a brigadier general in command of medical command, but like the strategic seminar that I was speaking of to the general staff, I I believe I might have been the only woman in the room, or at least I was the only woman speaking. And I think that lack of representation at the highest level is where you see some of those decisions made that do negatively affect women, because they just aren't at the decision-making table. There's certainly a lot in the CIMIC and InfoOps realm as well that I've seen, and that, you know, speaks to one of the real strengths that women bring to the military is that ability to understand human terrain and connect with the populations, and they have certainly seized upon this. But we had a really great initiative. In early September, we organized a gender conference, a curriculum development conference, and it brought in gender advisors and representatives from all of the officer academies, from across, and gender advisors from across all of the security forces, so emergency services, NGU, border guards, armed forces, and they all sat and talked about the problem. Major General Bourgon from Canada came and opened it with a whole bunch of real tangible things that you can do to make things better. And then they spent the week, you know, sort of dissecting, what do we need to do on the education front? What do we need to do to break down these barriers to meaningful inclusion? And that's going to result in, within the year, a standardized curriculum across all academies that tries to tackle some of this with education.
So we have two related questions. One is, what can the Ukrainian diaspora in Canada be doing to support the mission? And related to that is the best way for members of our Ukrainian Canadian community to support the outreach programs by donating to Boomer's Legacy?
Boomer's Legacy is a great option, absolutely. And we're just trying to explore some new options. Like, we recently, up until my rotation, we didn't actually have someone in who was officially in charge of outreach. So we now have a J9 officer, like a CIMIC officer, who's trying to wrangle all of this and find how we can do more and how we can bring in more sources of funding. So that is one that I can certainly follow up on with him, because we are looking at trying to leverage, like for this medical center in Dnipro, we're certainly looking to connect the Canadian diaspora to this. We have a Padres fund that we maintain in theater, that, you know, family members and stuff have donated to as well, and we do a lot of fundraising for. That's actually how we funded the majority of our outreach programs. So if the diaspora is interested in donating to that, that will be super helpful, because it's a very quick, responsive means that we have. Like, most of the other mechanisms take more time, but Boomer's Legacy is certainly a wonderful one. You know, that's how we supported Veterans Hub, and several other initiatives during the time that I was there. Some of those were actually started by the previous rotation. The other thing that's great that the diaspora does is helping with the preparation of teams before they deploy. Like, these sort of communication or discussions that you can have with the people deploying to help them better understand the context that they're deploying into. That is, I found that super valuable, getting to sit down with some of the folks on the line here before I went. So you go into it with a better level of understanding.
Okay, the next question we have is, as previously discussed, the Ukrainian Canadian community has been encouraging the government of Canada to extend Unifier beyond March 2022, as well as to expand its mandate. Based on your recent experience on the ground, in what ways could Op Unifier be improved, or perhaps its mandate expanded to maximize benefits to both the Ukrainian Army and the Canadian Armed Forces and NATO?
So we spent a lot of time thinking about that while we were there. The challenge that we're facing in the military is that, right now, with the impacts of COVID and a whole bunch of other factors, like we are extremely strained on the force generation front. So when we were looking at in theater, trying to look at what could we propose for the military options for mission renewal, we were trying to look at it. How can we do it without breaking the Army? Because again, there is really not much left when we talk about expanding at some of those key leadership ranks. The areas that I would say are really interesting, CTC Cherokee Land, there's a lot of work to be done there at that combat training center to bring it up. And a lot of that can be done, with contracting and money and material donations and things like that. It doesn't necessarily have to be more soldiers on the ground. Another area that all of the missions have identified as a gap, we all have a tactical component and we've got a strategic level component, but there's a missing middle and it's really key, the operational level. So you're talking like operational commands, service commands, even the high tactical level, like working with brigade commands. Most of the missions on the ground don't have the ranks really required to get in there and deliver good staff training, teaching them NATO process, teaching leadership, teaching institutional leadership, and helping them understand all the things that the tactical level and these new officers and NCOs coming up are already being taught and understanding. And if we aren't able to get that level, we're only going to be able to go so far with our reforms because, people meet a block when they come back out to their units and they get back to the brigade and they're not employing any of these NATO procedures because the brigade simply hasn't been taught. So there's a real opportunity to reach into the operational level with staff training. And also working at the National Defense University in professional military education. Tons of work still for junior people. And that's an area that the Army has lots of. Like, if there's one thing I found is that there's no shortage of employment for junior NCOs, sappers, corporals, privates, lots of work there. And you can do a lot without, again, compromising force generation. If the Navy's interested, again, the Ukrainians are certainly, rebuilding a Navy that was largely lost. A lot of the capability was lost when Crimea was occupied. So no shortage of work there on naval leadership, diving, boarding parties, supporting. The Navy is also part of that new, well, not new, but the operational capability components process, declaring subunits to NATO. So I think supporting that process is also a really promising initiative, because although it only reaches a few units, that model, all of the lessons that they learn going through that NATO evaluation can then be laterally shared to like units. So those are a few of the options. I mean, if with more people at senior ranks, there's an awful lot we could do, but obviously there's a lot of constraints right now that we're dealing with from our force as well.
Okay, so we have two questions here. One is, how capable would you say the Ukrainian Air Force is? And the second part of a question would be, is there, I mean, you just mentioned sort of the naval element, and we all saw Operation or Exercise Sea Breeze recently. If there's anything you can comment on those, on the naval dimension and on those training efforts.
Okay. Unfortunately, I'm not extremely well positioned to comment on Air Force capabilities. It's not an area that I worked extensively with. We did work on joint integration, and I can speak to the fact that there are a lot of challenges when it comes to joint integration and airspace management and deconfliction, integration of airspace and fires, that piece. There's a lot of work to be done there. But beyond that, I mean, I certainly saw aviation more frequently, and they were delving into the integration of aviation and live fire. So that's certainly a promising step, but the Air Force capacity at large, I don't have a great feel for. With respect to the Navy, yeah, Seabreeze was very interesting. We had teams on the ground, so we actually had a tab in earlier as well, teaching naval leadership and naval tactical navigation. And then during Seabreeze, we had a whole series of mentors who came in to work with the Maritime Component Command staff, as well as a naval dive team and boarding parties. Again, the Navy is obviously rebuilding. They've got new ships, I believe, in the works in conjunction with the UK, but all of those capabilities are very much in the rebuilding stage. Same thing with the Odessa Maritime Academy, fairly, I think, newly stood up. A lot of, not a lot of instructors that have been with them for a long time. So again, this is certainly not my sphere of expertise. We did work more prominently with Land Force, but I did have the chance to see the Navy at work during Seabreeze and see obviously the huge need there when it comes to Black Sea security, but also the opportunities there for the RCN to support, even with episodic training opportunities, like to come in, a couple times a year and support dive training, or support a boarding party going through the NATO declaration process. Those sort of things aren't a huge investment, but have a lot of value.
So this question is from a CAF veteran who was deployed on Unifier for 2 rotations in 2019 and 2020. One of my proudest accomplishments was forming a partnership between Joint Task Force Ukraine and the Ukrainian Leadership Academy, an NGO committed to building the next generation of youth leaders. Can you please give an update on this partnership or other Joint Task Force Ukraine NGO partnerships formed during the mission? Thank you.
Certainly, yeah. We so our professional military education team is still very much engaged with the Ukrainian Leadership Academy. They've had multiple opportunities to go to speak with some of the young folks there, and it's as rewarding for our team as it is for the youth. I mean, you're talking, I think your top 3% of students in the country. So they're hugely motivated and enthusiastic and super valuable. No doubt people who are going to be leaders in the future of the country. Some of the other NGOs that so yeah, please rest assured that partnership is alive and well and continues. And I don't think that'll change anytime soon. When it comes to other NGOs, we've worked really closely with Come Back Alive on this last rotation. So that, I believe, is one of the very prominent NGOs that has worked with supporting the military since 2014 in terms of, so they provide equipment, training. They're continuously in the JFO delivering training to brigades who may not have got it during their rotational training. Things like artillery software, engineer training, sniper, counter sniper training. But they're also doing a lot of really interesting studies on things like, why are people leaving the armed forces? Like what are the issues in the culture or more tangible issues that are driving people out of the military? So we worked a lot with them, building that relationship, looking at both the training and the cultural aspect. And we're going to be moving forward, I think, with one of their former leaders is now actually the gender advisor to the Land Force commander, and she came in loaded with great ideas for culture change initiatives, and she's going to start with Land Force headquarters, and I believe Unifier is going to partner with her and Land Force headquarters on that first trial that can hopefully spread wider. Then across the board, things like Veterans Hub, and a whole myriad of smaller NGOs all around the country that we're working with. Yeah, huge hugely valuable and so valuable for our members.
I just have, there was one question I saw, which was, will this event be recorded and posted, which I can answer. And yes, it will be shared by UCC National in the next day or two. So I think, Andriu, we are coming to the end of the Q&A portion, and I think I'll turn it over back to Andriy Sukhaniusk.
Okay, thank you, Otis. So thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Lake, and we certainly thank Roto 11 for service in Ukraine on behalf of Canada. So thank you very much, and welcome back to Canada.
Thank you.
I would now like to call on Colonel Andriy Shmilik, military attaché at the Embassy of Ukraine in Ottawa, for a few brief remarks. Over to you, Colonel Shmilik.
Good evening, all. Thank you very much for ground. I'm Colonel Andriy Shmilik, Ukrainian military attaché here in Canada, honored to represent Armed Forces of Ukraine. Since the beginning of Russian aggression, with the support of international allies and especially Canada, Ukraine has decreased our combat losses almost in 10 times. And I'm very pleased to emphasize that Canada is our main partner and friend who support the Ukrainian armed forces. Taking this opportunity on behalf of the armed forces of Ukraine, please accept our sincere appreciation for the comprehensive support provided to Ukraine in strengthening our defense capacity, improving the operational capabilities of armed forces, and getting us closer to NATO standards. Thank you for your job, Melanie. God bless you and your family. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colonel Shmilik. Finally, I'd like to call on Lasa Vinitska, member of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress Provincial Council of Ontario Executive, for her closing remarks. Lasa, over to you.
You're muted.
This is where lip reading skills come in very handy.
Lester, you're muted.
So sorry. Okay. Dobry večer, good evening. On behalf of the Ontario Provincial Council of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, I thank everyone who joined us today for this update on Operation Unifier. I actually see that we had guests from Newfoundland, Winnipeg, Calgary, Ottawa, Halifax, Edmonton, Montreal, Chicago. So it was just a wonderful way of reaching Ukrainians from across Canada. Thank you to our partners at UCC National and the Ukrainian Canadian War Veterans Association of Canada, and to its president, Andriy Sukhaniusk, for moderating this presentation. Lieutenant Colonel Lake, thank you so very much for a most informative, interesting, and inspiring presentation about the outstanding work of the Unifier mission that you led. We are grateful to the men and women of our Canadian Armed Forces under your command, and whose commitment to serving our country we deeply admire. As Ukraine further integrates its armed forces and defense structures with the West and with the NATO allies, we very much look forward to hearing more updates and suggestions on how we as a community can help. Myself, having recently returned from Ukraine, I noted how very much Ukrainian citizens appreciate and value Canada's support. Finally, let's keep in our hearts and in our prayers all of the Ukrainian soldiers who have given their lives, and for those who today are defending their country. May peace soon return in Ukraine. Thank you, merci, дякую. Slava Ukraini! Slava Kanadi.
So that concludes our evening. Thank you again to everyone for attending, and we will see you all soon. Dobranic. Good night. И дякую.
Good night, Dobranic.
Very much.